Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm your host, Amanda Lamb. In today's conversation with WRAL Investigates reporter Sarah Krueger, we're talking about a tragedy at a Raleigh rehab facility where a patient died. Carl Michaud Jr., who was a quadriplegic, died after falling out of his bed at the Raleigh Rehabilitation Center. His father wants to know how this could have happened. The WRAL Investigates team looked into the tragedy. Sarah, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So first of all, let's talk about how Carl ended up at the center in the first place. What was his life like before, and what happened to put him in this condition?
Yeah, so he was a very active person growing up and even well into adulthood. He was an avid outdoorsman, and even by profession, he was a youth baseball coach. Then in 2014, he got an infection that turned into a rare disease, and ultimately it left him paralyzed.
And so he was a quadriplegic, which means he didn't have the use of his legs and his arms. So he had just a very limited amount of mobility, which is why there's so many questions about this case.
Exactly. Yeah, very limited movement. So he had a little bit of movement left after this first happened, and then that was in 2014. Then in 2021, he got COVID, and his dad, Carl Sr., says after that, there was really not much left at all that he could move that significantly worsened his condition. So he could only make very slight movements of his neck. So he was quadriplegic and apparently had the best attitude, according to his father, such an optimistic person, and it just really drew people into him and blew them away that he could maintain such optimism even given his difficult circumstances.
So you've been talking to Carl's father, Carl Sr. Tell us what he told you about what happened to his son and when did this happen?
So he says he got a call from Raleigh Rehab on July 12th, where his son had been living for several years, and they told him his son had fallen out of bed, that he was on the way to the hospital. So, of course, Carl Sr. raced to the hospital to be with him. Unfortunately, by the time he got there, his son had already died. And the dad says because of his limited mobility, only being able to make very slight movements with his neck, he knows there is more to this story. He says his son just simply could not have fallen out of bed on his own accord. That would have been impossible.
Well, we will be right back with more on this after the break. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. So we were talking right before the break, so many questions surrounding this death of a quadriplegic man who had very limited movement, and his family was told he fell out of the bed, which they doubt could have happened on his own. So his dad, Carl Sr., reached out to Raleigh police. He also tried to reach out to administrators for the facility. What happened? What did he learn?
Not nearly as much as he is hoping to learn. He says he is not getting anything in any official capacity from the facility. He even went over there in person. He's been calling. He had to go clean out his son's room, and he has been very upset about all of this. He wants the chance to ask questions, and he says he's not being given that opportunity. So he now has an attorney who is taking over any attempts at communication with Raleigh Rehab. But so far he's been really struggling to get his questions answered.
And I know you also, of course, reached out to the facility and just recently got a response. What did they say?
Yeah, so I called the facility, and I was told that I would get a call back within the day, and I did. So I spoke with someone in upper-level management. I explained to them I would really like the opportunity to do an on-camera interview. If that wasn't possible, I'd like a Zoom interview, and last resort would be, a phone interview or a written statement. And all I did get back was a written email statement. And basically, it called this a tragic event and said that because of an ongoing investigation and confidentiality reasons, Raleigh Rehab would not be releasing any specific information.
Now, you also investigated the history of this facility, And you found out that there was a similar situation at this same facility, and there was some action taken as a result of that. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so earlier this year, another patient fell. That's documented in inspection records. And those records say that staff rolled the patient to her side on the bed, and then she fell to the floor. She survived, unlike Carl Jr. The facility then had to complete a safety improvement plan after that happened. And even earlier than that February 2023 incident, in 2021, there was another fall that's documented in the records that says a patient fell during a transfer and had a lacerated spleen and bleeding on the brain. And for that, the facility was fined about $51,000.
And I know, a lot of this is hindsight, but you talked not only with Carl's father, but you talked with a family friend. And in hindsight, they've looked back and said, okay, there were some red flags. There were some things at the facility that didn't make us completely comfortable that we might have paid more attention to. What did they tell you about that?
Right. They said that they saw a lot of roaches. That was one thing they brought up, a really prominent problem with roaches, and also had some issues with the food that was provided to Carl Jr. They felt like it wasn't an adequate amount of food, and, particularly given all of his different injuries, like he needed certain amounts of protein, and they felt he was not getting that. But they said he had a private room at Raleigh Rehab, which is something that he likely would not have gotten anywhere else. Typically, these places have shared rooms where you'll be in there with, there will be 2 beds, 2 patients. So the family, the dad, some of his friends at times had suggested wanting to move him, but they say that Carl Jr. really wanted to stay simply because of that ability to have a private room.
So what's going on now? Is the state looking into this at all?
Yes. So the State Department of Health and Human Services is doing an investigation, an unannounced inspection of sorts. Carl Sr. said the inspector told him that was underway. And I checked with DHHS. It may still be some more weeks before we see the results of that, but something that we are definitely going to be staying on top of. And as far as Raleigh Police, they did confirm to me they are looking into this. At this point, they are calling it a death investigation.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for shining light on this real tragedy, and I know you will continue to follow it. If you're listening to this podcast on WRAL.com or the WRAL app, you can also find it in any podcast app. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, pretty much anywhere podcasts live. You'll find more episodes of the WRAL Daily Download. As always, thanks for listening.